Hello, everybody, and welcome to our Wednesday webinar, How Funders Can Effectively Support Volunteer-Led Movements, hosted by EPIP, and really excited to have the TCC Group and Wikimedia Foundation with us today to present on this topic. My name is Biz Gormley. I'm actually fairly new to EPIP, so some of you may not have met yet, but I am running membership and operations here in our national office, and excited to be with you on this last day of September as we continue our fall webinar series. So we're going to take a few minutes in the beginning here to talk a little bit about who EPIP is for those of you who are new to our webinars or our community, share what we do, and go over some housekeeping for this webinar. And then I'll pass the reins over to our presenters, and they will be taking over for the majority of the hour to share their expertise with you. So many of you probably know EPIP well, but for those of you who are new to EPIP or have only just heard about us in passing, Emerging Practitioners in Philanthropy, EPIP, is a national network of foundation professionals, social entrepreneurs, and other change makers who strive for excellence in the practice of philanthropy. And what we do is provide a platform for our community to really do three things. We connect, give a space for you to connect with each other, offer resources and spaces to learn and practice your leadership skills, and also through thought content, as well as our annual conference and other events, inspire emerging ideas in the social sector. So if you're new to EPIP and you have questions about any of these things, please feel free to reach out. We're excited to always be growing our network. You can immediately get involved by attending our next webinar, which is in 2 weeks on Wednesday, the 14th of October. It's going to be at 3 p.m. Eastern Time, and that topic will focus on managing discomfort, tough conversations about identity to strengthen your work. It's going to be led by folks from NCRP and a few of their guests who are consultants and experts in this field. You can check out our website, epip.org, for the registration for that webinar, and epip.org/events for any of our upcoming events that our chapters are holding across the country, as well as online events. So like I said, housekeeping for this webinar, we're going to ask that you use the question box on your control panel if you have any technical difficulties, if you can't hear, if there's weird sounds that come up. But you can also enter your content questions there for the Q&A. At the end of the presentation, as I mentioned, our presenters will be answering questions, and they will be looking at that chat box, question box, to see what you have asked. If you're live tweeting or if you're posting about this on social media, please feel free to use the hashtag EPIPWebinar to join the conversation on social media and for us to track your voices and stay connected that way. We will be recording this webinar, and it will be up on our website a little bit after today's presentation. And at the end of the webinar, you will get a post-webinar survey emailed to you, and we'd love it if you would take just a minute or two to fill that out. It's not long, but your feedback really does help us make sure that we're providing content that is helping you grow as a professional and also is resonant for you in your work. So please take a minute to fill that out, and like I said before, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out. So at this point, I'm excited to both thank and introduce our speakers for today. We have two great speakers from the TCC group, Marika Spence and Rika Gorn. And they're being joined by Winifred Olive from the Wikimedia Foundation. They've put together some great content, so I'm going to let them tell you a little bit more about who they are and jump right into it. So let me just take a second. All right.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Biz. For everyone who's participating today, hello. We're so glad that you could join us for today's webinar. We're really excited about it. So as Biz mentioned, the topic of our presentation today is volunteer-led movements and specifically how funders can support them. So this is obviously a big and important topic, lots of different angles. But before we dive in, I'll just quickly introduce our team now so that you can put a face to a name and to a voice. Speaking as Marika Spence, I'm with TCC Group. TCC Group is a social impact consulting firm. I'm joined today by my colleague Rika Gorn and also by Winifred Olaf from the Wikimedia Foundation. Unfortunately, Deepti Sood, who you see bottom left on the slide, couldn't be on the phone with us today, but she was such an integral part of putting this session together, and we really valued her ideas throughout. So we'd just like to acknowledge her now. Thanks so much, Deepti. And we'll go to the next slide. Great, so this webinar has 3 basic sections, and our objectives for the next hour map to those sections. In the first third of the discussion, we're going to focus on why volunteers and volunteer leaders in particular are so integral to movements. We'll examine 4 distinct types of volunteer leader in the movement context. In the second part of the session, we're going to add a third sort of layer, if you will, to the conversation and look at the role of organizations in movements and how volunteers can leverage them for greater impact. To see how volunteers and organizations can work effectively together, we'll take a closer look at the Wikimedia Foundation and Wikimedia movement, and at that point we'll also give Winifred an opportunity to share her perspective and insights. Finally, in part 3, we're going to end our discussion with some takeaways on how funders in particular can support volunteer-led movements. And we'll offer those of you participating today some resources that we hope might be helpful to you in your own work.
And along the way, we've also peppered in a few interactive polls to collect perspectives and input from everyone participating in the webinar today. So please feel free to use the chat function at any time to message either of us with questions or comments, which we will answer at the end of the session.
Great, we'll go to the next slide. So we've obviously already done some quick introductions, but before we really move into the content of our discussion, we want to give you some brief background on who we are and some context for how we came to put this session together. As I mentioned, I'm Marika with TCC Group, and I work primarily in the firm's philanthropy practice, collaborating with clients to solve problems related to strategy, program management, and capacity building.
Hi everyone, I'm Rika Gorn, and I'm an analyst at TCC Group, where I work with both nonprofits and philanthropy clients on strategic planning and other issues, and I have a special focus on capacity building and evaluation for learning.
And I'm Winifred. I work with the Wikimedia Foundation, and I work in our community resources team, and what we do is we offer resources to volunteers who are doing work in our movement.
And just a note on our collaboration, today we're on the phone with Winifred because we worked on an organizational effectiveness project over the past year. And we'll talk a bit more about that later on and also provide you with some links for those of you who would like to learn more. But for now, let's jump into our next slide.
Great, so this is our first poll of the session. So we've introduced ourselves as presenters. So we'd like to take a quick poll of everyone participating here today and find out your role or roles in philanthropy. So if everyone could please select as many of these options that apply to you, we'll take a moment and tally the results.
Okay, we're almost at complete. Bear with us.
Great. Fantastic. So it looks like almost half of you here today are staff at a foundation or other grant-making organization or body, which is fantastic. Great. Well, it's nice to have everyone here today. We can go on to the next slide. Great. So what do we mean by the word movement? In this case, we're really talking about a group of people with a common agenda who are trying to advance an idea or a cause or try to affect some kind of large-scale change. So this could be social, political, environmental, or really something else entirely. But a key differentiator in a movement is the fact that a movement is driven by a group not an individual who happens to have outsized influence or resources. Next slide, please.
Great. Thanks, Rika. So we take as a given that volunteers are integral to movements. You know, it's hard to think of a movement with credibility that doesn't have any volunteers at all, whether it's related to the environment, social justice, civil rights, politics, or any other big issue. And we're going to go out on a limb and assume that most of you participating today share that feeling about volunteers, that they are part and parcel of movements. So what we want to focus on in this discussion today is really the role of specifically volunteer leaders in movements. So how do we define volunteer leaders? We're looking at those volunteers who are really shaping and driving the movement they're part of. We could use the photo on this slide as an example. Every participant in this Black Lives Matter demonstration is probably a volunteer, and they're playing a valuable role, no doubt. But the volunteer leader in this scenario might be the person who organized the demonstration. Perhaps it's the person who is going to document and share the impact through media or other avenues. Perhaps it's the person or the group of people who worked on the signs that some of the people are holding in this picture. That just gives you a sense of who we're referring to when we talk about volunteer leaders. We'll move to the next slide.
Great. So welcome to our second interactive poll. Before we do a deep dive into some of the types of volunteer roles that we see within movements, we'd like to gauge your opinion on the types of roles that you've seen volunteers play. So you'll see on the slide some examples of volunteer leader roles. This isn't an exhaustive list, so if you don't see a leader role in the list that you think belongs there, please message us and let us know. So we have here 4 different roles, which we're going to talk a little bit in more detail later on. We have community organizer, we have project manager, we have content engine. So this here refers to somebody who produces thought leadership, a content creator, skills-based, creates projects, materials that are used in a movement. And then the last one is strategist. So if everyone could take a quick moment and vote on what you think is the most common role that volunteer leaders play in movements. Great. So here we see that 56% of folks here today think that the most common role is a community organizer, followed by a project manager, a content engine creator, and then a strategist. This is really interesting. I think that community organizers probably who we hear about pretty often, especially in the last few years. So we'll be talking a little bit more in depth about each of these 4 roles and what they all do. So going on to the next slide. So starting with the most common that folks believe, this is the community organizer. So the role of the community organizer is to bring people together around a common issue, to inspire people to act and inform and educate them on ongoing changes, challenges, events around a particular issue. The community organizer is really critical to cultivating new relationships with partners, and is really the person that works on the ground and with the local community as much as possible. So when working with community organizers, it's really important that funders think about how best to build trust with that volunteer and the community that they represent, because there can often be a bit of suspicion initially when starting to work closely with a large funder. But the community organizer also provides a really unique perspective for funders and can be a great way to understand how individuals and communities are directly impacted by different policies and laws, and in many cases, oppressive systems. So up on the slide here, you'll see our example of a community organizer, and that's Saul Alinsky. Saul Alinsky was considered to be the founder of modern community organizing. He organized around improving living conditions for people in impoverished communities, particularly in the back of the yards neighborhood in Chicago. And later on, he went to found the Industrial Areas Foundation. So this is our community organizer. Next, we'll go on to the next type of volunteer role. So this is the project manager or is a volunteer leader. So this is typically a behind-the-scenes role. that is incredibly important for movement building, as the project manager is really making sure that things are happening on a day-to-day basis. The project manager sets goals, creates timelines, and then makes sure that they're being followed. She mobilizes resources and makes sure that the work on the ground is really being done. So since the project manager is directing a lot of the work that's going on behind the scenes, it's really important that she has access to other folks that are involved in the movement. So a funder can be really instrumental here in providing valuable connections or even a liaison from the funder who will work closely with the project manager. An example of a project manager that we have up on the slide here is Cristina Jimenez, who is the managing director at United We Dream. So United We Dream is the largest immigrant youth-led network, and they do really amazing work organizing around various immigration and justice issues. So next we'll go on to the third leader volunteer.
Great, thanks Rika. So volunteer leader role number 3 is content creator, also known as a content engine, as we referenced earlier. And this is a volunteer leader role, but it might not be quite as obvious as, say, the community organizer or project manager roles. And this volunteer literally creates materials or services that are invaluable to the movement cause. The role is frequently skills-based, or it may draw on the specific knowledge, wisdom, or experience of the volunteer. As a content creator, this person is a sort of thought leader for the movement. She may contribute substantial ideas. Some, but not all, content creators may choose to operate behind the scenes of a movement and maintain a lower public profile. Again, that's some, but not all. On the right side of the slide, you'll see Grace Lee Boggs. Boggs is a well-known social and community activist and philosopher. She's sort of a jack of all trades, fascinating person. She focused on the struggles of marginalized groups and the working class in Detroit and other places. And we've suggested her as an example of a content creator in part because she's a prolific writer. She's authored more than 4 books, and continues to write articles and a lot of material that has really shaped the movements of which she's been a part. And I'd also just like to mention as an aside that she celebrated her 100th birthday in June, so happy birthday, Grace Lee. And we'll move on to the next role, and that is strategist. And I'm a little surprised that folks thought the community organizer was the most common role, because I would have thought maybe some more people would have voted for this role as well. Strategists are yet another type of volunteer leader. This role is perhaps the easiest to identify in movements, aside from community organizers, because strategists tend to be individuals who are a prominent public voice and who may have the vision and charisma that inspires others to join a cause, as well as the skill set to work with formal institutions and groups, such as government. The strategist might be a type A kind of person. There are a lot of examples that come to mind when we think of strategists in volunteer-led movements, but we've chosen Cesar Chavez on this slide. And he's, of course, the farm worker and Mexican-American leader of the labor movement, who, among other things, was able to use a super savvy PR strategy to gather nationwide support for farm workers. It was really pretty unprecedented what he was able to do. And as a fun aside as well, you may recall the slogan, "Si se puede," which was used by President Obama during the 2008 election. And Chavez was actually the person who coined that term. And we'll move on. Great. Winifred, do you want to talk?
Yeah, thanks, Marika. So this is Winifred from Wikimedia Foundation, and this slide shows a few ways to support volunteer leaders. And these ideas come from some real work that we've done in our community to ask stakeholders what they need and what they prioritize in terms of receiving support. And funding is a big part of the picture, and we'll talk a little bit later about some of the specific types of funding that have been really helpful in supporting organizations that work with volunteers. But besides giving funding in the form of grants to groups, organizations, and individuals, we found that volunteers need a lot more than that. So we have, in recent years, refocused so that we can build up other types of support. And we've included here some types of support that are prioritized. Among those types of support, one thing that is very important to the people we work with is connecting them to each other. So If we know one volunteer leader is working in a certain area or on a certain type of project or in a certain role, and we know that somebody else has experience, oftentimes the most valuable way to build the capacity of that first person is to connect them to the other person. So as a centralized funding agency, we can also play the role of making those connections. We also find there's a big demand for resources to do different programs. So sometimes volunteers are really passionate about an issue or a project or a cause, but they don't have everything they need to get from point A to point B. So providing resources online can be a really efficient way to get that information to the greatest number of people possible. And we also, as an organization with a lot of expertise, can offer our volunteers in-kind support, expertise in specific areas. It might be something having to do with technology in our case, since that's a big focus of our work. It might be some skills in project management. It might be arranging logistics for travel in cases where volunteers don't have the capacity to do that on their own. We've also been moving towards doing more work both with individual volunteers and organizations, where we're working one-on-one with particular leaders in the community over time. So using a mentorship approach and forming longer-term relationships with people who we really want to build up as leaders. And along those lines, providing training for volunteers in specific skills, so that they can train others in their community, so that they can achieve certain goals that are important to them. And one thing that I wanted to emphasize, because it isn't always emphasized by funders, is that fundraising is really important to volunteers and volunteer-led organizations. So providing funding is a really good way to support them, but sometimes there are ways you can also support them in asking for funding from other sources or building their capacity to ask for that funding effectively. And that's something that, especially among organizations, we've heard identified as really important. Can we move on to the next slide?
Great, thanks, Winifred. So that actually provides like a really nice segue into the second part of the webinar today, which is really adding that third layer of organizations into the mix. So we know for a fact that volunteers provide a lot of the drive, the passion, the moral imperative for movements. And in addition, of course, they do a lot of the grunt work too. We know that volunteer leaders can accomplish a lot. So what is the role of organizations in volunteer-led movements? Why do they exist? Why can they be helpful? So we see three fundamental ways, or we would posit that there are three fundamental ways in which volunteers and others who participate in movements can use organizations effectively. And the first point here is really about consistency. So there may be volunteer leaders who see their movement work as a life's calling to which they devote consistent attention over a long time frame. However, for many other volunteers, the level of their commitment and the hours they can devote really fluctuate. We all know how life and work can throw us severe curveballs, and those same events affect volunteers who transition in and out of movements a lot. So organizations can provide this really valuable consistency and make sure that important projects are appropriately resourced over time. If we want to take a look at one particular example, we might think of, say, a natural disaster like Hurricane Katrina. It took a while for that political and media spotlight to finally focus on Katrina. Volunteers played a really big role in helping people and places recover once it did. But invariably, that spotlight and the focus of some volunteers goes away over time, but the need is still very much there. So in that case, organizations can make sure that important projects don't end after an exodus of attention or an exodus of volunteers. The second point is about status and structure. So if a movement is seeking to change a law or a policy, for example, an organization can be a more appropriate tool than an individual volunteer. Let's think about the conservation movement as an example. The Nature Conservancy, as an organization, can participate in legal action. It can lobby the EPA, or it can quickly purchase large tracts of land in a way that may advance the movement, but would be super tough for an individual volunteer to do on her or his own. And then finally, the third point is about specific expertise. And I'd love to welcome Winifred back into the conversation to provide an explanation of how we're thinking about this particular role.
Sure. So sometimes volunteers maybe working towards a particular goal, and in order to get there, they need something that they don't have in their particular group, in their volunteer base. Some skills are harder to recruit for when you're looking at volunteers. Highly effective volunteer movements do get a lot of the skills they need from volunteers, but occasionally that's not possible. And in those cases, it can really help to have a paid staff person step in who has that expertise and can be hired to provide that. So that's a value that organizations can provide since they have the infrastructure to hire staff.
Great, thanks. Thanks a lot. We'll go to the next slide.
Great. So this is our third poll. So at this point, we'd like to take everyone's temperature on the role of organizations and their value in volunteer-led movements. So we just talked about the ways which organizations can leverage impact. So here you'll see some of those roles and a couple of others. So if everyone could just select one of these options, what you think provides the single biggest value of organizations and movements, that would be great. So this here includes aggregating and disseminating funds, bringing new volunteers into a movement, using organizational clout or status to lobby or fundraise, and then keeping consistency for high-value projects, and then providing specific expertise. Great. So we had a little bit of a divide here. We have 33% said that they think the single biggest value of organizations is using organizational clout or status. And then 33% also said that it is about keeping consistency for high-value projects, followed by aggregating and disseminating funds, and then specific expertise. Great. So now we're going to take a look at Wikimedia Foundation more and see how it sees its role in the Wikimedia movement. So over to you, Winifred. Go on to the next slide, please. Great.
Sorry, I was muted for a second there. So I just want to tell you a little bit about the Wikimedia Foundation and who we are, in case you aren't all familiar with our work. So the Wikimedia Foundation is the nonprofit organization that supports the Wikimedia movement internationally. So our movement is about sharing knowledge, and we do this a lot through our volunteer-led projects. You probably are familiar with Wikipedia. We also have a number of other projects that are focused on providing free content. So what we do is we support those projects in different ways. A large part of what we do focuses on software development, but we also have teams that work with our community of content contributors, and the community resources team is one component of that. So what we're all about is finding ways to curate and aggregate knowledge and make sure that that can be spread to everyone around the world. Next slide, please. So this is a slide that is really about how we support volunteer-led organizations. We do have some other areas of focus in terms of resources that support individual volunteers more directly, but we thought it would be interesting to talk specifically about how organizations and volunteers interact. So 3 things that we've found really helpful in our grant making to organizations specifically are general support funding, capacity building work, and participatory grant making. So by general support funding, also called general operating support, we mean that we give grants to some of our trusted partners that they can decide how to use. They can use those for operating costs as well as programs as well as staff. So this gives them a lot of flexibility, and we'll talk about some of the benefits to that later too. Capacity building work. So this is getting into those non-monetary resources that we provide. For organizations in particular, we've heard that capacity building work is very important because this is about not only helping the organization in the short term, but helping them build the internal capacity to move their work forward over time. And finally, we emphasize participatory decision-making processes across all of our grants, and especially in our grants to organizations, since often those are some of the largest grants we give. So people in our community who have a stake in the outcomes participate in the decisions about those grants. Next slide, please. So to get a little more concrete with what we're talking about, we've given some examples here about how two volunteer-led organizations in our movement have used different staffing models. And these examples are pulled from some case studies that were done as part of a project that I did together with Marika and Rika that was focused on building capacity for organizations in our movement. So on the one hand, we have Amical Wikimedia, and that's an organization that works on Wikimedia projects that are in the Catalan language. And on the other hand, we have Wikimedia Austria, and that's an organization that works on Wikimedia projects within a specific geographic region, Austria. So Amical's staffing model has one paid employee. That employee focuses exclusively on programs. So that person does no administrative work. All of that is handled by volunteers on the board. And their programs are all led by volunteers. They only pursue programs that have a really strong volunteer base. And the staff person is there to facilitate that, to go to meetings during the day when volunteers might be available, for example, to handle some of that work that needs a level of consistency that volunteers can't always provide, and also to make sure that the organization is staying in close touch with the volunteer community. So they've chosen to hire somebody who comes out of that community, who was a very active volunteer, who already had those strong relationships in place and could bring a lot of that expertise to the work that he does as staff. On the other hand, we have Wikimedia Austria, and they're also a lean organization. They have about 2.5 FTEs. They look towards their volunteer community to hire in as well. And again, staff are filling in gaps, so they're doing some work that volunteers aren't available to do in their community. And since they're working in a different context than Amical, their staff does do a lot more administrative work, whereas their board is more involved with leading the high-level strategy. They're also doing volunteer-based programs. They try to be flexible in how they allocate their staff and their programs so that they can adapt to the needs of their volunteers. And they also have a very proactive approach to reaching out to volunteers. They have a variety of ways of keeping in touch with their community. And one very interesting thing about them is that their volunteer community really likes to meet in person. So even though their work happens online, many of them know each other and interact face-to-face. So the organization has the opportunity to also interact with volunteers in that way, and to really speak to what volunteers are passionate about so that they can keep that engagement and interest going over time. That's also a big role that the organization and that staff provide. Next slide. So here are a few quotes that are illustrating what our volunteers have said to us about what's important in terms of funding organizations. So many of these quotes are taken from a recent consultation that we did with our volunteer community to redesign how we're offering funding. And we asked volunteers what they needed, what they prioritized, what suggestions they had for making those changes. And so these quotes are some of the answers that we got back about how different types of funding and other support are important to our community. So one thing that was emphasized was in-kind support. So in this case, we had a volunteer who told us that it would be great to provide access to technology staff for grantees to allow grant applicants to include money to buy back time. So in this case, they were sort of providing a framework for quantifying the value of this in-kind work. But they're saying that they want to lean on the expertise of some of the paid staff that are already available. We also heard about capacity building. So in this case, tools, advice, and consultation for organizational development. And that this is, besides financial report, one of the most important things for organizations to get, to have that longer term capacity building work and to have real resources for that, since sometimes volunteers don't have those resources and don't feel supported. Running an organization can be a lot of work for volunteers to do, and it's pretty easy for people to burn out. So that's something we want to avoid if we can find ways to support them. Participatory grant making is also something that's valued by our community. It is a reflection of the values of our movement in many ways. So it's about making sure that stakeholders, people contributing content to the projects are really involved in those decisions that they want to be. That's very compatible with our values and with who we are as a movement. And finally, to speak a little bit to the importance of general support, I'm sure this is something that everyone on this call is familiar with as well, but we hear, like many others do from our grantees, that this is super important. Having the general support funding has a number of benefits for them, including ability to plan with more stability over time. One thing that was brought up here in this quote that we're highlighting is that organizations are able to correct course. In other words, if they are learning on the ground about what's working and not working, and they have opportunities to make changes, having more flexible funding allows them to do that without a lot of back and forth between them and the funder. So they're able to make changes on the ground in one go instead of spending a lot of administrative effort on that. Next slide.
Great. Thanks, Winifred, for that. So we're actually nearing the end of the webinar, and we've covered a fair amount of ground already, so thanks for sticking with us, everybody. As we do wrap our discussion, we want to, and get to the Q&A, we want to leave listeners and viewers with a few takeaways based on our individual experience here at TCC, and then also some of the lessons that TCC and Wikimedia have learned together through the organizational effectiveness project that we referenced earlier, and that we may have time to talk a bit more about. So in the first third of the webinar, we talked about common volunteer leader roles and identified 4, and again, not an exhaustive list by any means, but we did identify community organizer, project manager, content creator, and strategist. So if you're funding movements and volunteer-led movements, keep your eyes peeled for those volunteer leaders. In the second part of the webinar, we made the case for why organizations can add value in movements. We found that organizations can provide consistency, structure, and formal status, and in some cases, specific expertise in ways that can augment and leverage volunteers when things work well. They don't always work well, but when they do, they can be helpful. And then finally, we talked about how funders can support those organizations to work well. We'd like to emphasize 2 corollary points here. And the first is that support doesn't always translate into grants or monetary support. And in fact, there are many other creative and effective ways to help. Second, any kind of funder support may face some inherent skepticism. Institutional funders in particular can face questions about credibility, control, and influence. One of the ways to combat this is to provide support that really always prioritizes volunteers and their needs and the ways in which volunteer leaders operate. So with that, we'd like to move on and address some of the questions I think that came up during the course of the webinar.
So before we jump to the questions, we'd also like to leave you with some resources and links that you can look at. So we have a few things here. We've included a link to material on the idealist.org website on best practices for volunteer management. Also, for those of you who are interested in learning more about our collaboration, TCC's collaboration with Wikimedia on organizational effectiveness, we've just released a short case study on our website. That's www.tccgrp.com. on the bottom there. There's also a few resources on the Wikimedia website. There are 3 resources. Winifred, could you talk a little bit about what these
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I provided some links here in case anyone is interested in learning more about some of the more innovative practices that we've discussed in this webinar. So the first link is a link to the Organizational Effectiveness Learning Center that we created together with the TCC group. So if you check out that case study that's on the TCC website, this is sort of the end product of that. So this is a tool for capacity building that we created for organizations specifically in our movement. And another thing that I've included here is a report that outlines the outcomes from a recent consultation that we did with our community in order to redesign our grants programs. And this pulled out some interesting ways of having a discussion like that with a wide group of stakeholders. And it also focuses in on some of the support areas that our volunteers prioritized in terms of providing resources with funding as well as non-monetary resources. And finally, I've also included here a link to a report that was put together about the Wikimedia Foundation's participatory grant-making practices. So that digs a little bit more into how volunteers are involved with the way that we make decisions about funding. And that's a pretty detailed report if that's an area that you're interested in learning more about.
Great. So we're just going to go through, and I know that we've had a few really good questions that have been popping up throughout the session. So I think we have time to definitely cover a few of those. One of you asked if we can talk a little bit about how to support really all volunteer organizations. And that's including organizations whose staff, board, et cetera, are all unpaid. So I have a couple of thoughts on that, and I'd also love to hear Winifred's perspective on it too. You know, all volunteer movements are not necessarily, some of them do have organizations as well. So you can have an organization that doesn't have any paid staff. I mean, my perspective is that technology is a fantastic way to support volunteers in that context by helping to connect them with one another. And also to help convene them and sort of to provide in-kind support, that can be very valuable as well. Just to illustrate the technology perspective or the point on that, you know, TCC has done work with pro-immigrant right movements, and in one instance, a grassroots group created a hotline, and it became a wonderful way for in that case, undocumented immigrants to be able to reach out and provide feedback and to get resources without fear. And so technology can be used very effectively to support volunteers in that type of situation. Again, it can sort of depend on the movement that you're talking about and the demographics and the group that you're working with. But there are a lot of ways that funders, I think, can support volunteers, you know, when irrespective of whether there are paid staff involved. We also found in that same project that funding capacity building in the way that Winifred was talking about, perhaps through an intermediary that can provide technical assistance for the volunteers on the ground, could train them in lobbying or sort of legislative activity or sort of anything that they really need, messaging. That can also give be a way to sort of reach out to them and support volunteers without, you know, stumbling over some of those issues about skepticism or funder influence or control, because you're funding an intermediary that is working with them on the ground, that has a much closer relationship and has an understanding of what they need. Winifred, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. So in our movement, we fund organizations that have paid staff. I think the organization with the greatest number of paid staff has about 60 paid employees. We also fund all volunteer organizations, and I think that supporting both types of organizations is an interesting conversation because there's often tension between staff and volunteers that are working together in a movement. So as a movement, we've worked a lot together on different ways to structure that in a useful way. Part of that is around some of the things we've been articulating here are value that can be brought by paid staff. Other things are value that can equally be brought by volunteers. So we see a great diversity of organizations. In some contexts, it makes a lot of sense for them to have paid staff, and in others, it makes a lot of sense for them to focus as volunteers only. I think one of the key differences that I think about when supporting both types of groups is the limited time that volunteers have. So as I was mentioning earlier, I think running an organization is hard work. I'm often very surprised and impressed when I run into volunteers that want to do that as opposed to being more directly involved with different projects. And it's easy for those volunteers to burn out when they're not supported. So I do think that providing non-monetary support is important for all types of organizations, but particularly for volunteer-led organizations. And another thing that's important to consider when supporting volunteer-led organizations is the amount of time you're asking volunteers to invest in a funding process. So I think to the extent that you can make your funding process more welcoming, easier, and more simple, you're going to be helping out people who are working toward that funding in their spare time versus paid staff who might have a much more professional approach to doing things like filling out a lengthy or complicated grant application. So I do think that it's possible to support both types of organizations effectively, but it's important to think about who you're supporting when you're thinking about the types of options that you're offering through your funding and other types of resources.
Thanks, Winifred. I think I completely agree. I think that's a really important point that you make about streamlining and making things, sort of funding and applications, grant applications, really easy for volunteers. And that actually relates to another question that popped up during the webinar, which was whether we could speak to groups like American Red Cross and Habitat for Humanity. And actually, it's interesting that somebody mentioned that because as a precursor to the project that we worked on with Wikimedia Foundation, TCC Group did a benchmarking phase, if you will, where we looked at several different organizations that had some similarities to the Wikimedia movement, Wikimedia Foundation and movement. One of those was the International Federation of the Red Cross, which is, of course, the American Red Cross is the U.S. branch of that. And in speaking with the leadership at the IFRC, we learned from them that really they're seeing a different trend with volunteers and how they interact with Red Cross movement. People used to be sort of card-carrying members for life of the American Red Cross, of the IFRC, and now they're getting a lot of younger volunteers who are committing in a deep way, but over a short period of time. So they're seeing that kind of atomized volunteer base where people are coming in and moving out. And of course, that's fantastic, but there has to be something to sort of manage that. So one of the ways that they're really helping organizations in different countries with that, Red Cross branches, is by providing a training manual. And they're trying to get as much of that online as they can. They're also translating a lot of their volunteer handbooks and materials into different languages. And all of that is, again, to Winifred's point, just to try to make things as efficient, as streamlined as possible, and to kind of provide some consistency so new volunteers can get up to speed really quickly, and they don't have to sort of reinvent the wheel or recreate that Red Cross handbook every time somebody comes into the movement. Winifred, do you want to mention anything on that yourself? Or?
No, I think you covered it, Marie.
Great. That's about it from our end. We would welcome to continuing the conversation with anybody who's participated today. You can see our contacts here, and please do also think of Deepthi if you have questions for her. She knows this stuff cold too, so please do shoot us an email or call us and reach out. We'd love to continue the conversation and answer any questions that we didn't have a chance to get to today. But with that, I'd like to just thank Biz, Emily, and the folks at EPIP for the opportunity to present and share our ideas. And we'll throw it back over to you, Biz.
Great, thank you guys so much. It really was wonderful content, and it's great to see the specific examples as well as the high-level thinking. So thank you. I hope that the rest of you guys on the webinar have enjoyed it, and that you'll take a minute or two to complete the survey when it pops up in your mailbox. Thank you all for taking the time to come together for this Wednesday webinar. We hope that we can welcome you all back in a couple weeks to the next one on the 14th, and hope that you have a great rest of your day.